Allie with Potomac Beads. Join me in making these everyday stud earrings to create a nice simple design that you can wear every day. Pick out some neutral colors, just some 15-0 Delicas, your nice 8mm Rivoli, and let's get started. So to start out with these everyday earrings, and I literally have been wearing them every day, we're going to be using 15-0 Delica beads along with a pad post, either a 6 or an 8. And we are starting out with Peyote stitch to go around this 8mm Rivoli, which is a newer size for us. I have strung on some .006 Wildfire beading thread, and I've chosen the green color because of my beads, some transparent Root Beer A bead Delica 15-0s. And I have on there 24 beads to make my first rounded section for my bezel. I'm going to sew back through the first couple beads, mine ended up being 5, and bring my thread and needle out. What that is going to do is create a loop that is going to go around my beads as I bezel them. And I have the Crystal AB 8mm Rivolis that I'm using. From here, I'm going to work up and build a couple rows of my Peyote stitch. So I'm going to end up building 6 rows of my Peyote stitch total, and I'm going to start with 3 to the back and then start downgrading as well as 3 to the front. To start, you're going to be adding a bead in each time you sew through a bead. So I'm coming out of bead, we'll call it bead number 1. I'm going to skip bead number 2. I add a bead to my thread and needle, and I sew through bead number 3. That brings that Delica sitting right next to bead number 1. Or I'm sorry, bead number 2. Sewing out bead number 3, we're going to add another one, skip over 4, and sew through bead number 5. This second bead will sit right over bead number 4. So you're going to notice as you're building this that you get a pattern of 2, 1, 2, 1 the whole way around the piece. We started out with 24 beads in our first original row, which becomes row 1 and 2 of our Peyote stitch. Each row now we are going to add 12 beads at a time. I've done 2, I have 10 more to add around creating my third row of my Peyote stitch. As you get ready to add in your 12th bead here, what you want to be doing is going back through bead number 1 and also stepping up into bead number 1 of your third row. So that row of 12, we're going to sew through our first bead that our thread was coming out of originally from that 24 row, and then also through the first bead in our row of 12. That is called stepping up. You'll notice that this second row kind of goes out almost like a flower. As we start to build this is rather the third row, as we start to build our 4th and 5th and 6th rows, you'll start to notice it creating a cylinder rather than going out like a floral design. From here, I'm going to add another row, adding in 1 bead and sewing through bead number 2 in my row of 12. You'll start to see that nice kind of tube start to take place. Add another bead, sew through bead number 3. So I've added 2 on, I have an additional 10 to add. Bead number 3 and sew through 4. As you start to add them, again, you're going to start to see that cylinder shape start to happen rather than it flowering out. I'm going to continue on adding in my 9 rest of this row of the 4th row of my Peyote stitch. I have gone ahead in my example here and done both rows 4 as well as number 5. If you need to count to figure out what row you're on, you can count up 2 beads next to one another or on a diagonal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When I'm coming out the 5th row, so I've added my group of 24 for my first 2 rows, and then I've added 3 rows of 12. Now what I'm going to do is add 2 beads coming out of bead number 1 from row 5, skip over bead number 2, and sew in to bead number 3, adding 2 beads onto my thread and needle. And what this is going to do is start pulling it towards the back of the design in order to close it in for my post to sit inside of. Coming out bead number 3 in that group of 12, I add 2 more beads into my needle, skip the next bead, number 4, and sew through bead number 5. I'm going to repeat this a total of 6 times, still adding 12 beads in, but only having 6 groups of 2. 2 more beads go in, coming out of 5, I skip over 6, and I sew through bead number 7 in that row. And I know they're tiny, so I'm trying to get up close here. I'm skipping over the one sticking up, and I'm going into the next one. Push those sets of 2 in towards the middle, and you'll start to see that interior taking shape. 2 more beads go on. Skip over the next bead in line, and sew through the next one. Pulling this through then, push that in towards the center. Again, 2 more. Skip over the next bead and sew into the 10th bead. Or sorry, 11th bead. We're going to skip over 12 as we go back and sew through number 1. Get a couple more of my Delicas out here. And with the Delicas, because they're so tiny, and there's like 2,000 in a tube, I just dump them out usually by a little bit at a time in the capful. 2 more beads go on, coming out bead number 11. I skip over bead number 12, and I'm going to sew back through bead number 1 that my thread was coming out of when I started to add my group of 2. Push that again towards the center and do a tight pull on your thread. Now what I have in the interior of this peyote stitch is 6 groups of 2. I'm going to step up through those first 2 beads that I added in this last row. Going through those first 2 beads that I just added, now what I'm going to do is add 2 more beads at a time and skip over a row of 2. So just like we did, we're going to add 2 beads, skip over the next group of 2, and sew into the 3rd group of 2 and out. I'm going to end up with 6 beads going on this time, 3 groups of 2. Again, coming out of that 3rd group of 2, add 2 more beads onto your thread and needle, skip over bead group number 3, and sew through bead group number 4 through both beads from that previous row. Push them in towards the center. Again, one more time. 2 beads, skip over the 6th group of 2, and go back to that first group of 2 that your thread was coming out of as you added these 3 groups of 2. What this does is pulls the back in nice and tight to be able to sit your actual pad post in the center. From here then, along the back, you can see what we're going to do is we are going to sew along those beads to get them closer. So coming out then, I'm going to go on into my first group of 2. Pull this triangle then tightly towards the back. Sew into the next group of 2. So I'm not adding any beads, I'm just sewing through the 6 beads that I just added, going through and picking up both beads at a time. So my thread is going to go through those last 6 beads. Now you can see I haven't pulled tightly, so that way you can see the thread a little bit on the interior there. And now what I'm going to do is give a nice tight pull, getting those to pull in towards the back of the design. I'm going to sew through those 3 one more time, really stabilizing that back. Now I'm going to be using a 6mm pad post, but you can also fit an 8mm in here as well. So a 6 or an 8 will work well. If you do have a 4mm, it can move around a little bit, but you can sew on one more group of just 1 bead at a time on those 6. You're going to end up in the back with a little triangular shape since we had 3 groups of our 6 beads. From here then, we're going to take our pad post or glue-on post. I'm using the surgical steel ones, and that will drop in right into that little triangle and hang out in the back of the design. From here now we get to have fun and bring our thread to the front of the peyote stitch I'm going to let my pad post just hang out here and take that out as I sew from the very back of the design up to row number 1 of my peyote stitch, and then we're going to add on to there. Coming out the back here, I'm going to go and downgrade through one of the last rows of 2 from our grouping of 12 beads. And then what I'm going to do is sew up on a diagonal through the peyote stitch. The goal here is that you don't want to see any extra thread that may be exposed between the beads. So I'm sewing up on an angle, making sure I don't expose any additional thread. Sewing on that diagonal till I get to the front of the design. Now I have about 4.5 feet of thread on my needle. This will finish both earrings and even embellish if you want to do a little embellishment on this side. Coming out the front then, here, my bead is going to be coming out one of the outermost beads at the top of the design. You can see that it has this little bezel, almost looking like a bowl. Now what we're going to do is close in that bezel to be able to hold in our 8mm Rivoli. As we progress now into the front of the design, I have my 5 standard rows of peyote. I'm going to do 2 more. So adding on to row number 1, I'm going to add a bead, sew through the bead that's sticking up. I'm going to do 2 more rows of 12 till I get a standard of 7 rows of my peyote stitch. Once I have those 7 rows of my peyote stitch, so 2 more times around the top here, then I'm going to go in and we are going to downgrade just like we did along the back, adding in 2 beads at a time and skipping over every other bead. So take 2 turns around, adding in 12 beads to get 2 more rows of your peyote stitch. After you have your 7 rows of your stitch, so we added 2 more to the top, I want you to drop in your pad post and then also put your Rivoli into the little surface there. It looks like it could be a little Barbie bowl too. If you're really into the shapes and making different vessels, you can do that as well. Now what we're going to do is really simply close it in. I'm going to add 2 beads coming out of my last row, my 7th row there of the stitch. Skip over bead number 2 and sew through bead number 3. Adding again 2 beads at a time, just like we did along the back. Skip over bead number 4 and sew through bead number 5. Pulling this to the center with your hands near the project rather than pulling your needle. 2 more beads, skip 6, sew through 7. Again, continuing on, 2 beads, skips 8, through 9. So you're sewing through every other bead from the previous row as you add in groups of 2. A couple more that I need to dump out here. And the reason I picked this root beer color or the luster color of my other pair is because really you can match them to everything and wear them every day. Skip over the next bead, add your 2. Push those in. And then I have 1 more group of 2 to add. Adding in 2 beads, skip over, and you're sewing back into bead 1. And at the same time, just like we did the other pass, I'm sewing through the first 2 beads that I added in this last row of my groups of 6, 2 at a time. So you can see it just holds it nicely in there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew through all of those groupings of 2. So just like we did on the back, we had 6 groupings of 2, and I'm going to sew through all of those. I'm not adding in any additional beads to this row. I'm just sewing through those 12 beads in those groups of 2. This is going to pull all the Delicas in towards the center of the design and also hold in your Rivoli while still being able to see a lot of it. The reason I'm using a Rivoli rather than a chaton is because of the pointed back along the chaton. I would have to make my little bowl that I did even bigger and deeper, and the earring would sit further off the ear. So I'm going in here, I've gone the whole way around, and I'm going to do a nice tight pull to get that inner kind of star shape on the piece. You can see it here really well with my green thread that I did on the vitriol piece right here, going through and having those 2 beads at a time go around the circle. From here, all I need to do is get my thread and needle, going around one more time just to hold in my crystal, back to the starter bead and tie off my thread ends. From there, if you want to, you can stop and have your earring done, or if you want, you can add a little row of crystals to the outer edge. If you want to add a little bling to the outer row, you can see here I've gone and come out my group of 2, and I'm sewing back through 2 rows of the peyote stitch on the diagonal, pulling my thread through as I tighten up that set around the crystal in the middle here. Coming out through bead number 2 there, row number 2 of my peyote stitch, I'm going to pick a 1.5 millimeter crystal, rondelle, add a bead, in that same row, skip over to the next 15-0 Delica. Give it a nice tight pull and that'll pop just kind of right in the middle there. Add a bead, skip over the next one, and again we're in row number 2 here. Go back to the next bead in that same row, going through the second row of the peyote stitch. So you just kind of have to keep track of where your rows are as you're going along the stitch. Add a bead, sew through the next bead in that row. You can see how this just kind of decorates that outer little edge a little bit, adding in a couple crystals that will sit nicely on the side of the piece. I'm going to continue going in here and adding in my crystals along the side of those delicas. As you're sewing in around that outer row, you'll notice because there are 12 beads, you're going to end up with 12 crystals. So again, you're just adding a bead, sewing through the next delica in that same row of crystals. So adding a bead, sewing through right here. Now because you're using the 8 millimeter Rivoli, don't think that you can't go in and change up and use a different size. If you have regular 11-0 Delicas, you can look and see the size of Rivoli of what type of Delica size you need. I like these because I called them the everyday because they're nice and dainty and tiny that you can literally wear them every day. And if you do a nice neutral color with every outfit. So keep in mind as you're going around and doing this, comment below, say what colors you're going to do your everyday earrings in that you would wear, as well as what size Rivoli you are doing in the center of the design. In addition to the Rivoli, keep in mind that you can go bigger, go with regular 15-0s, or even stick with the 15-0s as the Delicas rather than progressing to 11-0s for a bigger size. The 15-0s just give you a nice dainty look. As I go in now and add the last bead, I'm going to be coming out of the first Delica bead that I was exiting when I added my crystal. When I come out of there, just a little wiggle room here, I'll let go and you'll be able to see just that nice simple little design with it added in. So whether or not you want to keep it nice and simple and have that every day or add some crystals, there's tons of varieties to choose from. The last thing you need to do, if you didn't do the crystals, this is where you're going to pick up. You're just going to take your thread and needle, skirt back around the design, bring those 2 thread ends together, and simply tie a knot and burn off the thread edge. As always, thank you guys so much for joining me in making these everyday stud earrings. Remember, you can also take this pattern and the design and make it yours by doing it as a bracelet and connecting maybe smaller and bigger Rivolis together. Having another piece of jewelry hang down from it, maybe again another bigger Rivoli or even a teardrop. Check it out, make it your own, as well as comment below and let us know what you're going to do with your pattern and also how you're going to change it up. This is also a great opportunity to help others in the beading community to learn from your expertise and your advice. Remember also to post your pictures in our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making of your everyday stud earrings, as well as any changes, ideas, and suggestions that you may have. Remember, you can give a little thumbs up and subscribe to get regular updates from us here at Potomac Beads. Thanks so much for watching and enjoy your new stud earrings.